Hello, my name is Angela Kleps, and this is my senior presentation on the LIFO repeal. I am going to be doing this presentation to try and convince you that we should repeal LIFO. LIFO is the last in, first out method of accounting, and it has been accepted since the 1930s in an industry that was not expected to take off the way that it has. And now that the United States and Japan are the only countries in the entire world that use LIFO, I think it's time that we abide by the IFRS standards and we all use average cost or the FIFO method of accounting, not LIFO. It creates a reserve for companies to be able to use in any way that they want, and it just completely decreases their tax revenue and their tax reporting, and it's not an accurate way of valuing their inventory. So I just wanted to quickly run through the history of LIFO, such as GAAP, the Securities Act, why LIFO was deemed a good idea, and how it was lobbied into being able to be used as a generally accepted accounting principle, the Revenues Act, the conformity rule, and where LIFO stands right now. So GAAP is the generally accepted accounting principle. This is what the United States goes by. So just some of the principles of GAAP are regularity, consistency, sincerity, prudence, and continuity. Those are just some of the rules of GAAP, and that's what I have to follow every day. The Securities Act plays a pretty big role in LIFO just because that was passed right after the Great Depression. The Securities Act was passed for investors and investees to have the same level of clarification on what they were doing. It just says that they need to provide all documentation for issuers or issuees for those securities because that was the fall of the Great Depression. And the Securities Act plays a big role in how LIFO was put in as a generally accepted accounting principle. We're going to talk about why LIFO was a good idea. In the 1930s, after the Great Depression, this was just like the industry era. This is when oil and metal was just booming. So oil companies wanted to pass LIFO just because nobody forecasted that the cost of the oil and the materials would continue to go up and up and up and over time. And even though it was going up a little bit every year, LIFO would create a little bit of a gap for them, but it was never forecasted to be what it is today. So that's why LIFO was lobbied only for the petroleum industries in the 1930s, and it was slowly, taxidermists were allowed to use it, tanners, smelters, slowly more and more companies were allowed to use LIFO. So in 1939, when it was determined that all companies that could use LIFO realistically were allowed to use LIFO, and that's when the conformity rule came. The conformity rule with the Revenues Act states that if you use LIFO for tax purposes, you need to use it for depreciation, you need to use it for your investors, you need to use that form across every single one of your accounting financials just to keep that level of consistency. So if you use it for taxes, you have to use LIFO for everything. And then we can talk about where LIFO stands today. It wasn't until the Bush administration that they really lobbied to get rid of LIFO, and that's where a lot of the conversation has come up about repealing LIFO. And then the Obama administration, in their financial projections for when he was running for office, he also put out a LIFO repeal. And in their estimations, a LIFO repeal with his 10-year plan would create $81 billion in tax revenue for the United States. And with our deficit just growing and growing, that seems really appealing to a lot of people. One of the other most interesting things that I found when I was doing my research is global taxation. I assumed going through college that LIFO was just a thing in the United States. And even though it is accepted in the United States, it is not accepted globally. Companies that operate globally, because of the Securities Act and the non-conformity rule, they have to use LIFO as their tax reporting, even in countries that don't acknowledge it in any way, shape, or form. So countries that people are operating out of, when they get their tax income, it's off of the LIFO amount, not an average cost or a FIFO. So not only is the United States not receiving the tax income amount that they should based off of the inventory that they actually physically paid for and their real cost of goods sold, other countries in the entire world are also not getting the right tax income off of those securities and that taxing. So now I wanted to talk about what would happen if we actually did go through and we repealed LIFO. Currently, right now, if you're a business operating and you want to switch your financial standards from LIFO to average cost, you have 4 years to pay back that LIFO reserve on that tax income, because you'll obviously have a huge difference in that. So currently it's 4 years. When the Obama administration was lobbying, they were offering a 10-year plan to pay that back. And currently there's been really no talk about what we would do now. A couple other options are saying is get rid of the nonconformity rule. Let people just use LIFO for other purposes, but use average cost for their tax filing. That might be more beneficial to them to show investors a LIFO rule versus an average cost, but still pay their taxes average cost. There's also been a lot of talk that a LIFO repeal would put companies in a serious amount of debt. So the Tax Foundation did do a little study on the impact of a LIFO repeal, saying that there would be 7,700 fewer jobs. The economy would have a GDP reduction of $11 billion. The capital stock would also lower $53 billion in the long run as a result of the repeal of LIFO. If companies are obligated to pay these higher taxes, then they're not going to be able to hire more people. They're not going to be able to buy more buildings, pay more real estate tax. They're not going to be able to boost the economy the way that the United States should be doing. And they're saying this would just stunt our growth for a minimum of 5 years if we were to repeal LIFO. And the other option that people have suggested is getting rid of the nonconformity rule. It would allow companies to have to use the average cost and abide by the IFRS guidelines in the entire world and only use LIFO in the United States. This thought is to get more companies to base out of the United States, and whatever tax income we get, and they can keep their LIFO reserves. They can continue operating the way that they want, but to still get more companies to want to base out of the United States with the temptation of being able to use LIFO for their inventory valuation. In conclusion, LIFO should be repealed. It is not only offering tax avoidance in the United States, but it's offering it across the entire world. And I believe that we should be able to abide by the IRFS guidelines, and that we should all use average cost for our inventory valuation. I think this would create a complete level of transparency with all the companies in our books. The place that I currently work uses LIFO, and talking with the CFO, she was not super thrilled that I was writing my paper for repeal of LIFO, because she is so in love with the tax avoidance of LIFO. So this just really solidifies the fact that companies love it, they want to use it, and they have an inventory that constantly and continually looks like it's going to grow and get more expensive. LIFO, all it does is just make the company more money and make them pay less taxes.